what's quite interesting, what shifted over the last 24 hours is the Ukrainians started saying that it was nearly done, but that it needed to be signed in Washington. And then lo and behold, last night, Trump says he's going to see Zelensky in Washington.
Let's start with the UN, because we've been talking a lot on the programme this morning about how important what happened last night was. What exactly does it mean, do you think, going forward, both for US, UK, EU relations and also for the UN itself?
Well, I think that certainly the Security Council vote there exposed the divisions between Washington and its European allies. So we saw a vote go through for a Security Council resolution that was neutral on the conflict, which is absolutely not the position of the European states. So you saw countries like Britain and France abstain from that vote. They could have vetoed it, interestingly, and perhaps we're not prepared to go that strong on the US. But in the General Assembly, there was a vote where all countries have equal weighting and no one can veto. And in that forum, the language was much more in favor of Ukraine. So really, it's a sort of taking of the global temperature. And what that has yielded is the fact that Washington is at odds with the community of nations, not only its allies in Europe. And neither of those are binding in any way. They're sort of statements of position. So I think it's just sort of put down on paper what we already knew. But, it's there in black and white now.
And to put it down on paper is to draw a huge line that hasn't been drawn before. I mean, it came after this meeting between President Macron, President Putin. It seemed very jovial. It seemed like the two men got on very well. But then to see these votes, do you think it's fair to say now that we should very much see what President Trump does and maybe not pay so much attention to what he actually says?
Does. I mean, it's kind of, it comes to the same conclusion in the end. I mean, I think Macron actually did a very good job there of trying to sort of charm Trump, Freudian slip there, trying to charm Trump and, and gently correct him on some of the misinformation that he was coming out in real time there, about how much money had been contributed, that kind of thing. But yes, ultimately, what Trump actually does, the course of action he takes is much more important because, for example, he came out yesterday with saying that Russia had no problem with European troops. Well, let's see what Moscow have to say again about that, because that's not been their position so far. And I doubt it. I doubt it will be going forward. So, yeah, ultimately, actions speak louder.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it came in those comments. A reporter asked in the Oval Office, Donald Trump, whether Putin would accept troops as a peacekeeping force. And he said, I've spoken to him directly about that. He's fine with it. He will accept that. Can we take that as read? I mean, we've not heard very much overnight from the Kremlin. We've not had any real response to that remark. How likely is it, though, given that a lot of this for Putin is about pushing NATO back?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still think it's very unlikely. It could potentially pave the way for, a non-NATO presence if there were to be one. If some country like, India that, feels like it's sort of in the middle there might, want to put its stamp on the world stage by offering that. But I'd be really surprised. I mean, the American side, of course, their position is they would like the Europeans to do it, even though Hegseth made very, very clear that it wouldn't be under a NATO flag or anything like it. The Americans' desire to get the Europeans there is born of the fact that they don't want to send American boots anywhere on the ground. But just thinking in those terms doesn't really take into account what Russia is prepared to allow. And I don't see that. I don't see Russia bending on that one, or why they would.
Yeah. Just finally, we've talked to you a bit before about this idea of a critical minerals deal. It's been on the table. We know that the US is pushing for it. We've had some slightly strange reports overnight. Reuters is reporting that Russian President Vladimir Putin offered the US the opportunity for joint exploration of the country's rare earth metal deposits, as well as a supply of aluminium to the US domestic market. Now, we don't know the full details of that, but on the bits that we do know about, How important do you think this minerals deal is to Donald Trump? And what do you think it says about the way that he might approach works with China and other countries in the future?
Well, I mean, it's a pure distillation of his transactional foreign policy. He also, it's interesting some of the vocabulary he's used around it, that that the US would look stupid, as he says, if it didn't get something back for all the money it's put into Ukraine. So he sees it in those terms. So yeah, I think it is important to him. I think that what's quite interesting, what shifted over the last 24 hours is the Ukrainians started saying that it was nearly done, but it needed to be signed in Washington. And then lo and behold, last night, Trump says he's going to see Zelensky in Washington. So I think that what the Ukrainians are doing with the mineral deal at the moment is using it to get Zelensky into the Oval Office to speak directly with Trump, which he wasn't succeeding in doing before he linked it to the agreement in that way. I mean, Russia's suggesting sort of joint exploration, I think, is Moscow's way to try and get around the fact that this minerals agreement could sort of deliver the US onto Ukraine's side, and also would get around the fact that a large percentage of the rare earth metals are in Russian occupied territory. So I think that's what the Russians are sort of saying is, oh, you know, don't worry about where they are because we'll give you access to all of it. So I think everyone's trying to offer up the biggest slice of the pie.
But isn't that just a sort of acceptance that that territory is now lost? I mean, I know that that's something that some leaders have been willing to say in public. It's certainly not Ukraine's position publicly. Is this now just accepted that Crimea is now Russian territory and will be for the foreseeable future?
Well, not by Ukraine or by any means, no. But, you know, clearly, I mean, Russia said it had annexed the entirety of the 5 regions of Ukraine in which it has a presence, even though 3 of those it isn't in control of the entire province, but it still formally considers them to be now part of Russia. So again, I think this is something that Ukraine is obviously going to have to negotiate over. But I don't see Ukraine ever acknowledging the Russian occupation in a legal sense or a sovereign sense. I mean, I think that they could, you know, as has happened in previous conflicts, they could acknowledge the de facto control that Russia has over those areas without ceding them formally.
Catherine Philp, our World Affairs editor at The Times, who is in Kyiv. Thank you very much for your perspective this morning on that story. We are joined now by Sviatoslav Jurash, who is an MP in President Zelensky's Servant of the People party. Good morning.
Good morning.
What is your reaction to what we have heard overnight from Donald Trump? There was obviously that meeting with President Macron. Some people might feel optimistic. How do you feel?
We remember Churchill. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at the situation with Trump's statements over the years, they have been multiple in all directions. And actions, though, have been helpful as well. He has provided weaponry to Ukraine in the first term of his, with that weaponry that has been put to great use in destroying the Russian tank columns that were advancing on Ukraine after February 24th, 22. So the point is that with Trump, you don't know. And we have to try and wait.
What is the perspective of I suppose, Ukrainian politicians looking at what happened at the UN General Assembly last night? We've been talking about the fact that the US sided with Russia in 2 of those instances. Catherine Philp there explaining just quite how remarkable that situation is. What do you make of that?
And North Korea, might I add.
And North Korea.
Yes, it is quite incomprehensible that's happening, but many more actors within the United States of America and it having a very busy media field will point that out and throw that at Trump administration's representatives, because no man is an island, and as far as American governance institutions are plentiful. to convey the basic points to him and his people, that it's quite incomprehensible to side with the dictators of the world against a nation that is battling for freedom.
Does it give you less faith in those international institutions like the UN, like NATO, to be able to back up Ukraine, to be able to support Ukraine, seeing what happened last night?
It was always a fight in the UN in terms of trying to convince different countries to understand our point of view and trying to support us as we are battling for our very existence. And it was never meant to be an easy discussion diplomatically around the world. So this only continues. This only continues international diplomacy, which is never ending as far as telling the world our story, our situation, and asking the world to condemn the aggressor.
And in terms of what President Trump said last night about President Putin, he said that Putin would accept troops on the border, that the two men had spoken about it and that Putin was fine with it. Do you believe that?
Agreements with Russia are not worth the paper they are signed on. That's not been said by me. It was said by many actors that have dealt with Russia over the centuries. So my point is that Putin says many things, but then in the end, he does do what destroys the international community and its institutions time and time again.
So you don't believe those words that you heard? You don't have any faith in them?
Well, we negotiated with Russia for 8 years. As a result of that, we had full-scale invasion. To believe Russia and towards Mr. Putin is to be ignorant of very basic history, even of the latest kind.
Do you think Donald Trump is naive to believe those guarantees from President Putin?
It's quite hard for me to judge Mr. Trump's thinking as he changes so many times, so many subjects. So to be very confident about his perspective at the moment as the last and final perspective is not something I would dare do.
Sviatoslav Jurash, an MP in President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, thank you for giving us your time on the programme this morning.